October 13th, 1945. A Saturday evening in central Pennsylvania. The air carries the first true cold of autumn, and across the rolling farmland that surrounds the town of Hershey, the last light drains from the sky in bands of copper and gray. The street lamps flicker on along Chocolate Avenue, their glow falling soft against the pavement. The air itself carries a faint sweetness, cocoa and sugar, the permanent perfume of the factory that never sleeps, its smokestacks exhaling into the October dark. At the top of a long curving drive, set back from the road and half hidden by ancient oaks, High Point Mansion stands in near-total darkness. Only a few windows on the second floor remain lit. The rest of the house, 22 rooms of it, stone and stucco, built to last for generations, sits in shadow. There are no visitors tonight, no family, no heirs waiting in the parlor. The household staff moves quietly through the corridors, speaking in low voices, attending to a man who has not left his bed in weeks. Milton Snavely Hershey lies in his private chamber on the second floor. He is 88 years old. His body, once sturdy and restless, has failed him at last. The official record will note pneumonia, heart failure, the inevitable collapse of a system worn down by nearly 9 decades of relentless motion. But those who knew him in his final years speak of something else, a stillness that had settled over him long before his lungs began to struggle, a withdrawal, a kind of quiet that seemed less like peace and more like surrender. Outside his window, the town he built stretches in every direction. The factory, the trolley lines, the department store, the hotel, the schools, the churches, the orphanage, every structure, every street, every blade of grass on every manicured lawn exists because Milton Hershey willed it into being. He designed this place as a model community, a worker's paradise, a monument to the belief that industry could be humane, that profit and benevolence could coexist. For 4 decades, his name has been synonymous with sweetness itself, not merely the product, but the philosophy. The Hershey Company, the Hershey Trust, Hershey, Pennsylvania. He gave his fortune away. He built homes for orphans. He refused to lay off workers during the Depression. The newspapers called him a saint, a visionary, a man who proved that capitalism could have a conscience. And yet, on this October night, Milton Hershey dies alone. His wife, Catherine, has been dead for 30 years. They had no children. The great house that was meant to be filled with family stands empty but for servants and nurses. The fortune he accumulated, hundreds of millions of dollars, belongs now to institutions, to trusts, to lawyers and board members who will carry on his name long after the body is cold. He has outlived nearly everyone who knew him as a young man, as a husband, as anything other than a legend. The town outside mourns before the death is even announced, but it mourns an idea, a symbol, a benevolent ghost who has haunted these streets for decades. The man himself, whoever he was beneath the mythology, slips away in silence. The official obituaries will be long and laudatory. They will speak of his humble origins, his early failures, his improbable rise. They will celebrate his philanthropy, his generosity, his vision for a better world. They will not mention the years of isolation. They will not dwell on the strange architecture of his final decades, the way he surrendered control of his fortune while he was still alive, the way he retreated from public life, the way he seemed, to those who observed him closely, to be watching his own creation from a great distance, as though it had become something separate from himself. They will not ask why a man who built a utopia spent his last years in such profound solitude. They will not wonder what it cost him. The body is removed from High Point Mansion the following morning. The funeral will be modest, as he requested. The town will mourn. The factory will pause. And then within days, everything will resume. The chocolate will flow. The orphans will study. The trolleys will run on schedule. The machine Milton Hershey built will continue without him, as he always intended. The man himself will become a statue, a portrait, a name on a building. The silence of his final years will be buried beneath the noise of legacy. But silence, in a place like this, does not stay buried forever. It lingers in the rooms of High Point Mansion, in the empty chairs at tables set for one, in the questions that no official history has ever fully answered. Why did he give everything away? Why did he build a town and then withdraw from it? Why did a man who spent his life creating sweetness die in such bitter isolation? To understand how this happened, we have to go back. The story begins not in chocolate, but in failure. Not in sweetness, but in the sour geography of disappointment that shaped a boy long before he ever learned to shape anything himself. Milton Snavely Hershey was born on September the 13th, 1857, in a small farmhouse in Derry Township, Pennsylvania. The land was Mennonite country, quiet, austere, governed by faith and work, and the unspoken conviction that virtue lived in plainness. His mother, Fanny Snavely, came from this world. She was a woman of rigid discipline, deep religious conviction, and an almost punishing practicality. She believed in labor. She believed in thrift. She believed that the Lord helped those who kept their heads down and their hands busy. The Snavely family had farmed this land for generations. They understood that survival was not guaranteed, that the earth gave only what you earned from it, and that dreams were a luxury the faithful could not afford. Milton's father, Henry Hershey, understood none of this. Henry was a dreamer in a community that distrusted dreams. He was charming, restless, convinced that fortune waited just beyond the next horizon. He dabbled in farming, in oil speculation, in one ill-conceived venture after another. He moved his young family from town to town, chasing schemes that never materialized, leaving behind a trail of debts and broken promises. Where Fanny saw the world as a test of endurance, Henry saw it as a game he was perpetually on the verge of winning. He never won. The pattern repeated itself throughout Milton's childhood: hope, upheaval, failure, relocation. By the time the boy was 10 years old, he had lived in half a dozen different homes and attended nearly as many schools. The marriage between Henry and Fanny was, by all accounts, a study in mutual incomprehension. She could not understand his recklessness. He could not abide her rigidity. They remained legally married for decades, but the union dissolved in spirit long before Milton reached adulthood. Fanny eventually returned to her family's orbit, taking her son with her, while Henry drifted further into obscurity, appearing only intermittently in his son's life. A ghost of possibility, a cautionary tale in human form. There was another child, a daughter, Serena, born 4 years after Milton. She died in 1867, not yet 8 years old. The records are sparse. The cause is listed variously as scarlet fever, as general illness, as one of the countless childhood deaths that were grimly routine in that era. What is known is that Fanny Hershey never fully recovered. Her faith deepened, her discipline hardened, and Milton, now an only child, became the sole vessel for her ambitions and her fears. He would not be like his father. He would not chase phantoms. He would learn a trade. He would work. Milton's formal education ended after the 4th grade. The family could not afford more, and Fanny did not believe that books alone made a man. What mattered was apprenticeship, craft, the acquisition of skills that could be exchanged for wages. In 1871, at the age of 14, Milton was sent to Lancaster to learn the printing trade under a local newspaper editor. The arrangement lasted only a few months. The boy showed no aptitude for typesetting, no interest in ink and paper. He was dismissed, or he quit, depending on the account, and returned home in what must have felt like the first of his own failures, an echo of his father's pattern already beginning to assert itself. But Fanny Hershey was not a woman who accepted defeat. She found another apprenticeship, this time with a confectioner in Lancaster named Joseph Royer. The shop produced candies, caramels, ice cream, small luxuries for a town that had little enough of them. Milton began as a general laborer, sweeping floors, hauling sugar, learning the rhythms of a trade that was part chemistry, part artistry, and part relentless physical work. He was not a natural. The early years were filled with mistakes, burned batches, lessons absorbed through repetition rather than intuition, but something in the work took hold of him. Perhaps it was the transformation itself, the way raw ingredients could become something greater than their parts. Perhaps it was the simple, measurable nature of the craft. You either made good candy, or you did not. There was no room for his father's abstractions here, no space for dreams that never solidified. Confectionery was concrete. It was real. And Milton Hershey, for the first time in his young life, found something he could build. He completed his apprenticeship in 1876, the year the nation celebrated its centennial, the year Philadelphia hosted a great exhibition of American progress and industry. Milton was 19 years old. He had no money, no connections, no formal education, and a family name that carried the faint odor of failure. What he had was a trade, a mother's expectations, and the memory of a father who had spent his life reaching for things he could not grasp. The boy who left Lancaster that year carried both inheritances with him, the dreamer's ambition and the Mennonite's discipline, and he did not yet know which would prevail. He failed first in Philadelphia. The timing seemed auspicious. 1876, the centennial, the city swelling with visitors and optimism. Milton opened a small candy shop with money borrowed from relatives, mostly from his mother's side of the family. He made caramels, taffy, whatever he could sell from a rented storefront. For 6 years he labored, working 18-hour days, sleeping in the back of the shop, pouring every cent back into the business. His father drifted in and out, offering advice that was rarely useful and assistance that was rarely sustained. The shop survived, barely, but it never thrived. Philadelphia was crowded with confectioners, with established names and deeper pockets. By 1882, the business collapsed. Milton was 25 years old, broke, and returning once again to Lancaster, with nothing to show for his efforts but experience and debt. He tried again in Denver. The western cities were growing, hungry for goods and services that the East took for granted. Milton arrived with little more than his knowledge of candy making and a stubbornness that refused to recognize the pattern forming around him. In Denver, he learned something new, a technique for making caramels with fresh milk instead of the paraffin wax that most confectioners used. The milk made the candy softer, richer, more flavorful. It was a small discovery, the kind of trade secret that separated adequate candy from exceptional candy. He filed it away, stored it in the part of his mind where useful things accumulated. But the Denver business failed too. The details are murky. Loss of capital, a partner who disappeared, the usual litany of small disasters that sink small ventures. Milton moved on to Chicago. Chicago failed. He moved to New York. New York failed. Each time, he started with borrowed money. Each time, he ended with nothing but lessons. By 1886, Milton Hershey had spent a decade failing in 4 different cities. He was 29 years old. His family's patience was exhausted. His mother's relatives, who had funded venture after venture, refused to extend further credit. He returned to Lancaster not as a young man full of promise, but as something closer to what his father had always been, a man who chased things he could not catch. The only difference was that Milton kept returning to the same trade, the same craft, the same stubborn belief that he could make candy that people would buy. It was not optimism. It was something harder than that. It was refusal. He started the Lancaster Caramel Company with almost nothing, a single room, a few pieces of equipment, and the recipe he had learned in Denver. Fresh milk caramels. He made them himself, sold them himself, delivered them himself. The early months were desperate. He could not afford to hire workers. He could not afford to advertise. He sold to local shops, to anyone who would take a chance on an unknown product from an unknown man. The caramels were good, better than good. The fresh milk made them exceptional. But quality alone does not build a business. He needed capital, distribution, scale. The turning point came, as turning points often do, through a combination of luck and persistence. An English importer passing through Lancaster tasted Hershey's caramels and placed a substantial order for export to Britain. The order was large enough to require a bank loan. The bank, for reasons that remain unclear, extended the credit. Perhaps the loan officer saw something in the quality of the product. Perhaps he simply took a chance. Whatever the reason, the money allowed Milton to expand, to hire workers, to increase production, to fill the English order and begin pursuing others. The caramels sold. They sold well. They sold in quantities that transformed a one-room operation into a genuine factory. Within a decade, the Lancaster Caramel Company employed over 1,000 workers and generated annual revenues approaching $1 million. Milton Hershey, the man who had failed in 4 cities, who had borrowed and lost and borrowed again, was now one of the most successful confectioners in the eastern United States. He built a factory complex that sprawled across an entire city block. He installed the latest machinery, the most efficient production lines. He sold caramels to distributors across the country and exported them to markets as far away as Japan and Australia. The scale of the operation was remarkable, but what distinguished Hershey from his competitors was not merely size, it was quality. He insisted on fresh milk, on pure ingredients, on a product that tasted the same, whether it was purchased in Lancaster or London. He understood, in a way that many manufacturers of his era did not, that consistency was its own form of excellence. But even as the caramel business flourished, Milton Hershey's attention was drifting toward something else. In 1893, he attended the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the Great White City, that monument to American ambition and technological wonder. Among the exhibits was a display of German chocolate-making machinery, devices that could grind cocoa beans, refine cocoa butter, and produce solid chocolate on an industrial scale. Milton stood before those machines for hours, watching them work, studying their mechanisms, asking questions of the operators. Chocolate in 1893 was still a luxury product in America. Expensive, imported, available only to the wealthy. The Germans and the Swiss had mastered its manufacture. American confectioners had not. Milton Hershey looked at those machines and saw something that no one else in that crowded exhibition hall seemed to see. He saw the future, and he began quietly to plan for it. He purchased the German machinery before he left Chicago. The exhibition had not yet closed, and already Milton Hershey was arranging for the equipment to be shipped to Lancaster, installed in a corner of his caramel factory, operated by workers who had never touched a cocoa bean in their lives. He was not a man who waited for certainty. He had spent too many years waiting, too many years failing, to believe that hesitation led anywhere worth going. The machines arrived. He began to experiment. The early attempts were failures. Chocolate manufacturing was not caramel manufacturing. The chemistry was different, the tolerances finer, the margin for error almost non-existent. Swiss chocolate was smooth, delicate, refined through processes that European manufacturers guarded as closely as state secrets. American attempts to replicate it had produced coarse, grainy products that crumbled on the tongue and left a bitter aftertaste. Milton knew nothing about these processes. He had no training, no mentor, no access to the proprietary techniques that made European chocolate superior. What he had was the same thing he had always had: stubbornness, fresh milk, and the willingness to fail repeatedly until he stopped failing. The experiments continued for years. He hired chemists, fired chemists, hired new ones. He tested different ratios of cocoa butter to milk solids, different temperatures, different cooling times. He ruined batch after batch, dumping thousands of pounds of unsaleable chocolate, while his caramel business continued to generate the profits that funded his obsession. His workers thought he was mad. His competitors thought he was wasting his fortune on a product that Americans would never embrace. But Milton had seen something at the Chicago Exposition that went beyond machinery. He had seen the future of taste itself, the democratization of luxury, the possibility that what had once been reserved for the wealthy could be made available to everyone. Chocolate did not have to be expensive. It did not have to be imported. It could be manufactured here, in Pennsylvania, using American milk and American labor, sold at prices that working people could afford. The only obstacle was the manufacturing process itself, and manufacturing processes, unlike markets or tastes or fortunes, could be mastered through repetition. By 1900, he had solved it. The exact formula remains proprietary to this day, but the essential innovation involved the treatment of fresh milk, the same ingredient that had distinguished his caramels. Through a process of slow heating and careful condensation, Hershey's team developed a method that gave the chocolate a distinctive tang, a slight sourness that European manufacturers would later dismiss as a flaw, but that American consumers would come to identify as the taste of chocolate itself. The product was not Swiss, it was not Belgian. It was something new, sweeter, more accessible, designed for a palate that had never developed the refined expectations of European consumers. Milton called it milk chocolate. He believed it would change everything. In 1900, he sold the Lancaster Caramel Company for $1 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for that era. He kept the chocolate manufacturing equipment and the rights to produce chocolate under his own name. His associates were stunned. The caramel business was proven, profitable, stable. The chocolate venture was speculative, unproven, dependent on the uncertain tastes of a mass market that did not yet exist. Milton did not waver. He had made his decision years before, standing in front of those German machines in the White City. Everything since then had been preparation. He chose a site for his new factory not in Lancaster, but in the farmland where he had been born, Derry Township, Dauphin County, the Mennonite country of his childhood. The land was cheap. The dairy farms were plentiful, ensuring a constant supply of fresh milk. And there was something else, something harder to articulate, but no less real. Milton Hershey was returning to the place that had formed him, the landscape of his mother's faith and his father's failures. He would build his empire on the soil that had taught him what he was made of. Construction began in 1903. The factory rose first, a massive complex of brick and steel, designed to produce chocolate on a scale that no American manufacturer had ever attempted. But Milton was not building merely a factory. He was building a town. He laid out streets in a grid pattern, naming them after cocoa-producing regions: Caracas, Trinidad, Java, Ceylon. He constructed homes for his workers, sturdy, comfortable houses with indoor plumbing and electricity, amenities that were rare luxuries in rural Pennsylvania. He built a trolley system to connect the residential areas to the factory. He built a bank, a department store, a hotel. He built churches, schools, a community center. He built parks and gardens, a zoo, an amusement park. He built everything a town needed to function, and he owned all of it. High Point Mansion rose on a hill overlooking this creation. Construction began in 1908, 3 years after Milton married Catherine Sweeney, a Catholic shopgirl from upstate New York, whom he had met in a candy store. The house was designed in the Venetian style, 22 rooms of stone and stucco, with formal gardens, a conservatory, and views that stretched across the entire valley. It was the largest private residence in the region, a monument to the success of a man who had once slept in the back of a failing candy shop. But those who visited High Point in its early years noted something strange about the place. It was beautiful, meticulously maintained, filled with expensive furnishings and fine art, and it was almost always empty. Milton and Catherine lived there, but they did not fill it. The grand rooms stood silent. The long hallways echoed with footsteps that were never quite enough. The house had been built for a family. The family never came. Catherine Sweeney Hershey was not what Milton's family had expected. She was Irish Catholic in a world of Pennsylvania Mennonites, a working-class girl who had grown up behind a shop counter, pretty and vivacious, and utterly unlike the sober, practical women of Milton's upbringing. Fanny Hershey disapproved of the match with a coldness that never fully thawed. The marriage took place in 1905 in the rectory of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, a Catholic ceremony, a concession to the bride that must have cost Milton something in his mother's estimation. He was 48 years old. Catherine was 25. They had known each other for nearly a decade, a courtship conducted in the margins of Milton's relentless work schedule, visits stolen between business trips, letters exchanged across distances that his ambition always seemed to create. The early years of the marriage appeared happy, or at least content. Catherine brought warmth to High Point Mansion, filled its rooms with flowers and music, and the kind of social energy that Milton himself had never possessed. She entertained guests, organized dinners, softened the edges of a man whose natural inclination was toward solitude and work. Photographs from this period show them together at public events. Milton stiff and formal in his dark suits, Catherine smiling beside him, her hand sometimes resting on his arm in a gesture of easy affection. They traveled extensively: Cuba, Europe, Egypt. Milton combined business with pleasure, visiting cocoa plantations and chocolate factories, while Catherine explored the gardens and galleries that her husband had little patience for. They seemed, to outside observers, like a successful couple enjoying the fruits of extraordinary fortune. But the house remained empty of children. The reasons were never discussed publicly, and the private record is silent on the matter. Whether the cause was medical, circumstantial, or a matter of choice, the nursery that had been designed into High Point's floor plan was never used. The rooms intended for sons and daughters became guest chambers, storage spaces, monuments to a future that would not arrive. Catherine's health, never robust, began to decline within a few years of the marriage. The diagnosis, when it came, was a degenerative neurological condition. Some accounts suggest locomotor ataxia, a complication of an earlier infection, though the medical records from that era are incomplete and contradictory. What is certain is that by 1910, Catherine Hershey was increasingly confined to wheelchairs, to bed rest, to the care of nurses and specialists who could slow her deterioration, but not stop it. Milton responded to his wife's illness with the same methodical determination he applied to manufacturing problems. He sought out the finest physicians in America and Europe. He funded research into her condition. He modified High Point Mansion to accommodate her mobility limitations, installing elevators and ramps, redesigning rooms to make them accessible. When doctors suggested that warmer climates might ease her symptoms, he built a winter home in Cuba. When they recommended sea air, he arranged extended stays at coastal resorts. He spared no expense, pursued every treatment, refused to accept that his fortune could not purchase her recovery. But Catherine continued to fade. The vivacious young woman who had brought life to his empty mansion became a fragile presence, increasingly confined to her private rooms, increasingly dependent on the staff who attended her around the clock. The town outside continued to grow, indifferent to the quiet tragedy unfolding at High Point. By 1915, Hershey, Pennsylvania, had become one of the most remarkable planned communities in America. The factory employed thousands. The homes Milton had built housed a population that had grown from a handful of farm families to a thriving community of workers, managers, teachers, shopkeepers. The streets were paved, the lawns were manicured, the public buildings were handsome and well maintained. There was no poverty visible in Hershey, no slums, no squalor of the kind that blighted other industrial towns. Workers earned good wages, lived in comfortable houses, sent their children to excellent schools. The model community that Milton had envisioned was becoming real, and visitors from across the country came to marvel at what enlightened capitalism could achieve. But the model community was also, in ways that were not always apparent to visitors, a company town in the most complete sense of the term. Milton Hershey owned everything. The houses that workers lived in were rented from his company. The stores where they shopped were operated by his company. The bank that held their savings, the trolley that carried them to work, the hotel where their relatives stayed when visiting, the amusement park where they spent their leisure hours, all of it belonged to Milton Hershey. There was no local government independent of his authority. There were no competing businesses, no alternative employers, no institutions that existed outside the orbit of his control. Workers who displeased the company could lose not only their jobs, but their homes, their access to credit, their place in the community itself. The benevolence was real, but so was the power, and the line between them was thinner than the town's cheerful facade suggested. Catherine Sweeney Hershey died on March 25, 1915. She was 35 years old. The end came at High Point Mansion, in the bedroom she had occupied for the final years of her illness, attended by nurses and physicians who had long since exhausted their remedies. Milton was at her side. The official cause of death was listed as the neurological condition that had stolen her mobility, her vitality, her future. But those who knew her understood that she had been dying by degrees for years, that the woman Milton buried that spring had already been mourned in the slow accumulation of her decline. The funeral was private, the grief unspoken in the manner of men who had been taught that emotion was a form of weakness. Milton returned to work within days. The factory did not pause. The town did not slow. Whatever he felt, he carried it silently, a weight that no one else was permitted to share. But something had shifted in him. Those who worked closely with Milton in the years following Catherine's death observed a change that was difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore. He had always been reserved, formal, more comfortable with machinery than with people. Now the reserve deepened into something closer to withdrawal. He continued to oversee the business, to make decisions, to appear at public functions when required. But the appetite for expansion, for new ventures, for the restless building that had characterized his middle years, seemed to diminish. High Point Mansion, never warm, became colder still. He rattled around its 22 rooms like a man who had outlived his purpose, surrounded by servants who attended to his needs but could not fill the silence his wife had left behind. What Milton did next has been interpreted in various ways by those who have studied his life. Some see it as an act of profound generosity, the ultimate expression of a benevolent philosophy that valued community over personal wealth. Others see it as something more complicated, a response to grief, a search for meaning, perhaps even a form of penance for failures he never publicly acknowledged. The truth, as always, is probably some combination of all these things, filtered through a personality that revealed little and explained less. In 1918, 3 years after Catherine's death, Milton Hershey transferred his entire fortune to the Hershey Trust. The trust had been established in 1909 to fund the Hershey Industrial School, an institution he and Catherine had created for orphaned boys. The transfer included his ownership stake in the Hershey Chocolate Company, at that time worth approximately $60 million, a sum that would be worth well over $1 billion in later currency. He retained a salary as the company's leader, continued to live at High Point, maintained the outward appearance of a wealthy industrialist. But legally, technically, completely, he had given everything away. The fortune he had spent his life building now belonged to an institution dedicated to raising children he would never know, educating boys who would never call him father, creating a legacy measured not in personal wealth, but in the lives of strangers. The Hershey Industrial School had been Catherine's passion as much as his own. The couple's childlessness had drawn them toward orphaned children with an intensity that seemed to deepen as their own hopes for family faded. The school opened in 1910 with 4 students, 4 boys from broken homes who were given food, shelter, education, and the promise of a future. By the time of Catherine's death, enrollment had grown to dozens. By the time of Milton's great transfer, it numbered in the hundreds. The boys lived in group homes scattered across the community, attended classes in buildings Milton had constructed, learned trades in workshops he had equipped. They were not adopted, not given the Hershey name, not made into heirs in any legal sense. But they were provided for with a thoroughness that went beyond charity. They were given what Milton himself had lacked as a child: stability, consistency, the assurance that tomorrow would not bring another upheaval, another failure, another move to another town in pursuit of another doomed scheme. The transfer of wealth was structured with the same careful attention to control that characterized everything Milton built. The trust would own the chocolate company. The trust would fund the school. The trust would be governed by a board that Milton himself would dominate for as long as he lived. He was giving away his fortune, but he was not giving away his authority. The distinction mattered. Even in his generosity, Milton Hershey insisted on oversight, on structure, on the kind of rigid organizational discipline that left nothing to chance and little to others' judgment. The orphans would be cared for according to his specifications. The company would be managed according to his principles. The town would continue to operate as he had designed it. He was building a machine that would outlast him, a self-perpetuating system that would carry his values forward into a future he would not see. Whether this was wisdom or control, philanthropy or ego, remains a question that the historical record does not definitively answer. The 1920s brought prosperity to America, and Hershey shared in the abundance. The factory expanded, production increased. The chocolate bar that Milton had designed for the common man became ubiquitous, sold in every drugstore, every candy counter, every five and dime across the nation. The town grew with the business, new homes rising along new streets, new amenities appearing to serve a population that swelled with each passing year. Milton oversaw it all from High Point, attending board meetings, reviewing production reports, making decisions that shaped the lives of thousands. But those who worked with him noticed that his engagement had become increasingly abstract, as though he were managing the enterprise from a great height, watching the machinery turn without descending to touch it. He was in his 70s now, an old man by the standards of his era, though his health remained sturdy and his mind sharp. The habits of decades had calcified into rituals. He rose early, ate simple meals, avoided alcohol and tobacco, maintained the austere personal discipline his mother had instilled in him half a century before. He walked the factory floors less frequently than he once had. He spent more time in his private office at High Point, more time alone with ledgers and reports, more time in a silence that the servants had learned not to disturb. The town that bore his name had become, in some ways, a separate entity, a living thing that continued to grow and function regardless of its creator's daily attention. Milton had built it to run without him. Now he was discovering what that actually meant. The crash came in October of 1929. The stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Factories closed across America. Unemployment soared to levels that had seemed unimaginable during the fat years of the previous decade. Bread lines formed in cities. Families lost their homes. The economic catastrophe that historians would call the Great Depression settled over the nation like a long gray winter that showed no signs of ending. Hershey, Pennsylvania, did not escape entirely. Sales of chocolate declined as consumers tightened their belts, cutting luxuries before necessities. The factory reduced shifts. Profits fell. The pressure to lay off workers, to cut wages, to implement the same brutal efficiencies that other companies were adopting mounted with each quarterly report. The board members who now technically controlled the Hershey Trust urged caution, restraint, the prudent conservation of resources against an uncertain future. Milton listened to their advice. Then he ignored it. Instead of laying off workers, he launched what became known as the Great Building Campaign. If people needed jobs, he would create jobs. If the town needed improvements, he would fund improvements. If the economy had failed, he would build a separate economy within the boundaries of his own creation. Between 1930 and 1940, Milton Hershey poured millions of dollars into construction projects that employed thousands of workers who might otherwise have joined the desperate ranks of the unemployed. A new hotel rose in the center of town, the Hotel Hershey, a Mediterranean palace perched on a hillside overlooking the valley. A sports arena followed, then a community center, then a new high school, then a massive expansion of the amusement park. Roads were paved, utilities upgraded, parks landscaped. The workers who built these projects earned wages that they spent in Hershey stores, paying rent on Hershey houses, circulating money through a closed economy that Milton controlled as completely as any medieval lord had controlled his domain. The strategy worked, at least within the boundaries of the town. Hershey did not experience the mass unemployment that devastated other communities. Workers kept their jobs, their homes, their dignity. The chocolate factory continued to operate, continued to produce, continued to ship its products to a nation that needed whatever small sweetness it could afford. Visitors came to Hershey during the Depression years and marveled at what they found. A prosperous community in the midst of national despair, a model of enlightened capitalism that seemed to prove what was possible when business served workers rather than merely exploiting them. The newspapers wrote admiring profiles. Milton Hershey became, in the public imagination, a saint of American industry, proof that the system could work if only the right men were in charge. But the great building campaign was not without its costs, and the control that made it possible was not without its tensions. In 1937, those tensions erupted into the open. Workers at the chocolate factory, encouraged by the growing labor movement sweeping American industry, attempted to organize a union. The sit-down strike that followed was brief but bitter. Workers occupied the factory. Production halted. For the first time in the town's history, there was open conflict between Milton Hershey and the people he employed. The strike was broken within days by loyal workers and local farmers who stormed the factory and physically ejected the strikers. Violence was limited but real. The aftermath left scars that took years to heal. Milton's response to the strike revealed something about the limits of his benevolence. He was genuinely bewildered by the workers' grievances, unable to comprehend why men he had housed and employed and protected through the worst economic crisis in memory would turn against him. Had he not given them everything? Had he not sacrificed his own fortune for their benefit? The ingratitude stung him in ways he rarely expressed but could not hide. The union was eventually recognized, wages and conditions were negotiated, and the factory returned to normal operation. But something had broken in the relationship between Milton Hershey and his town. The paternalism that had seemed so natural, so benevolent, so obviously correct now, carried an undertone of resentment on both sides. The father had been defied. The children had been punished. Neither would forget. The final years of the 1930s found Milton Hershey increasingly removed from the daily operations of the empire he had built. He was past 80 now, an age when most men of his generation had long since retired or died. His body remained functional, his mind remained clear, but something essential had dimmed. The strike had wounded him more deeply than he admitted. The war clouds gathering over Europe reminded him of an earlier conflict, the Great War that had disrupted cocoa supplies and tested the company's resilience decades before. The world was changing in ways that made less and less sense to a man whose fundamental assumptions had been formed in the 19th century. He retreated further into High Point, further into routine, further into the silence that had become his most constant companion. The mansion itself had taken on the character of a mausoleum. The servants maintained it impeccably, floors polished, silver gleaming, gardens tended with meticulous care. But the grand rooms stood unused. The dining table that could seat 20 was set for one. The parlors where Catherine had once entertained guests gathered dust beneath their chandeliers. Milton occupied only a fraction of the house, moving between his bedroom, his study, and a small sitting room where he took his meals alone. Visitors were rare and seldom encouraged. The isolation that had always been part of his nature had hardened into something more complete, a withdrawal from human contact that went beyond introversion into something closer to renunciation. He still visited the orphan school. This, perhaps more than anything else, sustained him in his final decade. The boys, there were over 1,000 of them by now, housed in group homes across the community, represented the only family he would ever have. He attended their graduations, visited their dormitories, inquired about their progress, with a grandfatherly interest that seemed genuine even when filtered through his natural reserve. Former students who encountered him during these years described a man who was kind but distant, generous but formal, present in body but somehow absent in spirit. He gave them everything material they could need. What he could not give them was himself. The wall that separated Milton Hershey from other human beings had been built too long ago, reinforced by too many losses, to be dismantled in his final years. The Second World War transformed the chocolate factory into an instrument of national purpose. The military contracted Hershey to produce a specialized survival ration, a chocolate bar engineered to withstand extreme temperatures, provide maximum calories, and taste just unpleasant enough that soldiers would not eat it except in emergencies. The company manufactured billions of these bars, shipping them to every theater of the war, feeding American troops from North Africa to the Pacific. Milton took quiet pride in this contribution, though he was too old now to involve himself in the details. The factory ran without him. The company prospered without him. The town continued its orderly existence without him. Everything he had built was proving that it could survive his absence, which was precisely what he had intended, and precisely what left him with nothing to do but wait. His health began its final decline in the early 1940s. The specific ailments accumulated gradually: respiratory weakness, circulatory problems, the general erosion of systems that had functioned reliably for nearly 9 decades. Doctors visited High Point with increasing frequency. Nurses took up residence in rooms adjacent to his own. The household staff learned to move quietly, to speak in hushed tones, to treat the mansion as what it had effectively become: a hospice for a man who was taking a very long time to die. He made few public appearances in his final years. When he did emerge, for a board meeting, a school function, an unavoidable ceremony, those who saw him noted how diminished he had become. The sturdy, compact figure that had once strode through factory floors and construction sites had shrunk into something fragile, a wisp of a man lost inside suits that no longer fit properly. His voice, never strong, had faded to a murmur. His eyes, once sharp with calculation and purpose, had taken on a distant quality, as though he were looking at something no one else could see. The mythology that surrounded him had grown so large that the man himself seemed to disappear inside it. He was no longer Milton Hershey, the individual. He was Milton Hershey, the institution. And institutions do not die. They simply continue, indifferent to the mortality of their founders. The town outside High Point flourished in its peculiar controlled way. The war economy brought full employment, high wages, a sense of purpose that masked whatever resentments lingered from the strike years earlier. Young men went off to fight. Young women took their places in the factory. The chocolate bars flowed out by the millions, carrying the Hershey name to places Milton himself had never seen and would never see. The orphan school continued to grow, taking in more boys each year, educating them according to principles Milton had established decades before. The trust that owned everything operated smoothly, managed by men who understood that their authority derived from a dying man in a mansion on a hill. Everyone was waiting. No one spoke of what they were waiting for. The paradox of Milton Hershey's final years was visible to anyone who cared to look, though few seemed inclined to examine it closely. He had constructed a utopia, a model community that provided everything its residents could need: homes, jobs, schools, recreation, security. He had given away a fortune that most men would have hoarded, surrendering his wealth to a trust that would outlive him by generations. He had built an institution for orphaned children that would educate thousands, transforming lives that might otherwise have been lost to poverty and neglect. By any conventional measure, he was among the most generous men in American history, a philanthropist whose legacy would endure long after the monuments of lesser men had crumbled. And yet he lived alone in a mansion designed for a family he never had, attended by servants who were paid to care for him, surrounded by a town that revered his name but did not know him as a person. The contradiction ran deeper than mere loneliness. Milton Hershey had spent his life seeking control over his business, his town, his workers, his legacy. The failures of his youth had taught him that survival depended on mastery, that the world would crush anyone who left himself vulnerable to chance or the decisions of others. He had applied this lesson with extraordinary success, building an enterprise that functioned with mechanical precision, designing systems that would perpetuate his values long after his death. But control, pursued to its logical conclusion, produces isolation. The man who trusts no one finds himself alone. The man who builds walls to protect himself discovers that walls also imprison. Milton had insulated himself so thoroughly from risk that he had also insulated himself from the human connections that give life meaning beyond mere achievement. The relationship with his mother illustrated the pattern. Fanny Hershey had lived until 1920, dying at the age of 85, in a house her son had provided, cared for by servants her son had employed. She had never approved of Catherine, never softened toward the Catholic daughter-in-law who had failed to produce grandchildren, never relinquished the rigid judgments that had governed her entire existence. Milton had supported her dutifully, visited her regularly, deferred to her opinions long past the point when most men would have asserted independence. Their relationship had been one of obligation rather than warmth, duty rather than affection. When she died, he mourned as he had mourned Catherine, privately, briefly, returning to work as though grief were an indulgence he could not afford. The woman who had shaped him most profoundly left no visible mark on his public persona. He simply continued, as he always had, as he always would. The orphans offered a kind of substitute, though substitute may not be the right word. Milton's attachment to the boys of the industrial school was genuine, rooted in something more than public relations or tax strategy. He saw in them echoes of his own disrupted childhood, the instability, the poverty, the absence of reliable adult guidance. He wanted to give them what he had lacked, but his giving was mediated through institutions, through rules, through the same systematic control that characterized everything he touched. The boys were housed according to specifications he approved. They were educated according to curricula he endorsed. They were prepared for trades he deemed suitable. His generosity was real but bounded, filtered through organizational structures that kept him at a safe distance from the messy particulars of individual lives. He was their benefactor, not their father. The distinction mattered more than he perhaps understood. High Point Mansion in its final years became a kind of exhibit, a display case for a life that had already ended in every way except the biological. The rooms preserved the tastes of an earlier era: heavy furniture, dark woods, the formal aesthetics of late Victorian prosperity. Catherine's possessions remained where she had left them, maintained by servants who understood that nothing was to be moved, nothing altered, nothing allowed to suggest that time had passed since her death 30 years before. Milton lived among these artifacts like a curator in his own museum, surrounded by evidence of a past he could not release and a future he would not see. The present had become merely a waiting room, a space between what had been and what would come after. He spoke rarely of his intentions for the time after his death, but the structures he had created spoke for him. The trust would continue, the school would continue, the company would continue, the town would continue. Everything had been arranged, documented, protected by legal instruments that would bind future generations to his vision. There would be no heirs to contest his will, no family members to reinterpret his wishes.